What's happening, everybody? Welcome back to the next part in this warrior series that we are talking about. I kind of calling it different things, but it's all about looking at King David. He was this warrior king, and how God just worked in his life, and how he wrestled with so many different things, even early on, being young, and even before he took the throne as king himself. So we're looking at this. If you caught the first video, I'm kind of going back a little bit, kind of getting some groundwork laid out, get some context to before we actually get to David. So last part of the series I talked about, the first one, we looked at how Israel, God's people, was crying out they wanted an earthly king. They went to Samuel. They were demanding, well, not really demanding, but maybe demanding, who knows. But according to the scriptures, they were asking for a king like all the other nations around them had. They were wanting to put their trust and their faith into a man as opposed to continue doing it with God. And so it kind of put Samuel out of a job as being this prophet, this spiritual leader, this guiding instrument to God's people. Now, and this is what God said, give them what they want. And if you remember the story, God also wanted Samuel to specifically warn and instruct him, hey, this is what this earthly king is going to ask of you. Make sure that people are aware of that. And so he listed out all these things. People said, nope, we still want an earthly king like all other nations. They wanted somebody to go in that will lead them and fight for them. So almost kind of like, here, let's get behind this guy. He'll go do it for us and we don't have to do anything. But that's not really how it works. So that's kind of where we left off, kind of really diving into that and seeing how Samuel handled that rejection, so to speak. And the big part of that and the big takeaway from that is that when he was crying out to God that he felt rejected, God told him, says, they're not rejecting you, they're rejecting me. Here he is. He brought them out of slavery, out of Egypt all those years ago, out of 400 and something years of slavery. Brought them out, won them battle after battle after battle, and they're rejecting me, not you, Samuel. And so that was kind of like a very, somber type of realization, but also a comforting thing for Samuel. They're not rejecting you, they're rejecting me. So that's where we left off. So let's get this started in for today. So thank you again, and here we are into the next part of this warrior series, looking at David being this lion of war type of mentality. I didn't make up that title. I actually got that from a series of books, a fictional book that an awesome author by Cliff Graham wrote, kind of centered around David being this warrior king, but it's very suitable. It's very suiting. Nowhere in the scriptures does it call him that, but he was this fierce warrior, and his name was renowned during this time, not only among his allies, but his enemies, and everybody knew who David was. And we'll get to that later on. But today, this time, I wanted to kind of continue on just adding some context, building up to before David comes into the picture, really. There's nothing like a good story that builds that suspense, right? To get you built up before this hero comes in and radically changes what's happening. And I also kind of want to look at, you say the name David and you instantly go to these specific stories, big stories, Goliath and his sins with Bathsheba and all this stuff, right? You instantly go to these specific things, but hopefully I do a good enough job to be able to pull out some really good, deep cut stuff about David. And not just starting where David comes into the picture, but even beforehand, because this sets us up for a place that when David comes in, it matters, right? So not just where David enters, But here's how everything is and who the people are and what's going on before he even enters in the scene. And that will really build up to make a difference and really point out what David is entering into. And so, anyways, like I said, any good story will kind of do that, right? So hopefully I do well enough job to pull that out. So I'm kind of going to be paraphrasing, kind of skipping through some of this, and it might be a little bit shorter this time, but I just kind of want to hit some main points of the next couple of chapters where, Samuel is giving the people what they wanted for. He's talking with God, and God has a guy in mind who's going to be this very first earthly king towards his people. And so, you look here at chapter 9, and this is where kind of Saul comes into the picture, and he meets Samuel. Saul is just this ordinary, so to speak, guy, and he is actually kind of sent out because his father had some donkeys that got lost. They went astray. So he goes, he's on this mission to go out to try to find these lost donkeys. And he's searching all around. He comes upon this place, and he's like, you know what? And the other people who was with him, they knew of the seer. This is what they called prophets back then. They called them seers, people who, they were just in tune with God, and God spoke with them and moved through them. They kind of know what's happening. So they called him a seer or whatever. But they didn't know what to do. They didn't know where to go. So they said, hey, we're near where this supposed seer is. Let's go ask him which way we should go. Which path should we take? Maybe he's seen, maybe God has spoken to him about where our donkeys are, or something like that. I don't know. So he goes and he seeks out Samuel, and he comes across Samuel himself. And so basically Samuel and God have been having these conversations and knowing that God is sending a man his way. God is sending the man that is going to be this new first king to Samuel. And so he comes across him, right? He comes across Saul, and he invites him in. He prepares his feast. He's like, wow, how did you know it's coming? It makes him a true kind of fortune teller or a storyteller type thing, or a storyteller, a fortune teller, to be able to see the future type of stuff. Anyways, so he goes and they sit down to eat, and Samuel just drops the bomb on Saul, right? He says, hey, this is what God's telling me. You're going to be this king. And, it's not like, you got to put in perspective, it's not like what we know of today as far as kings, because this is the very beginning of this type of leadership happening. So it's not like you have to be of royal blood, become next king or something. There is no royal blood. Who's royal? You got to pick someone to start with, then it becomes down that line. That's how it kind of goes. So you even think about that. It makes you want to dive into history and see how these kings, how did they start to be the king? Mostly because they were wealthy and they had the most land, or I don't know. But it starts somewhere, right? And then it follows down the line of bloodlines and who's the next heir and stuff like that. So anyways, picking some random person as what it seems like to be the very first king, but see God's hands in this, right? God's hands picking who this first king is going to be. And it's really going off of what the people wanted, right? The more we talk about Saul, the more you paint this picture of who this guy is, it's fitting to what the people think they want as their king. It mentions later on, probably getting ahead of myself, but he comes around and he's like a head taller than everybody else. So he's just this physical presence, this physical leader there. And so it's a very strong first impression to be this first king. And if the people want this great leader to lead them in battle, no greater than somebody who's a head taller than everybody and just has this physical presence and can go and be this fierce battle leader type of thing. But see, God is giving them what they want. But God's hands in this, helping guiding this process. So Saul meets Samuel and he drops this on them. And of course, you can imagine Saul like, I can't believe this. And Samuel gives Saul some instruction on what to do. And you jump in, kind of skipping ahead a little bit to chapter 10, Samuel anoints Saul at this point in time. So, he anoints him earlier in chapter 9, and then he goes here and he continues to pour this oil on Saul's head and kisses him, and saying that, has not the Lord anointed you leader over his inheritance? When you leave me today, you will meet two men near Rachel's tomb at Zelzah on the border of Benjamin. They will say to you, the donkeys you set out to look for have been found. And now your father has stopped thinking about them and is worried about you. He is asking, what shall I do about my son? So Samuel already knows, hey, the donkeys you've been sent out for have been found. Go to this place. You're going to find these two men. You're going to find that out. And now your father's actually just wondering where you are. So father got the donkeys. He's like, okay, now I'm worried about my son. You guys go out and try to find my son now. And so he goes and he instructs them to where to go and what to do. And Saul is going and Samuel instructs him, and just, you got to keep in mind too, kind of how the culture is at this point in time. Their enemy is still around. So even though they're not locked in battle all the time, they still interact with the Philistines. And so Saul was instructed to go to this Philistine outpost, and here he's going to come across these prophets. So he's instructed to go, and Samuel tells him exactly what's going to happen. He says, you're going to go and you're going to come upon them, and you're going to start prophesying with them, and you're going to be changed into a different person. And so, once again, without diving too deep and trying to pull as much as you can out of scriptures, but you look at Saul's nowhere near that type of person. He's here sent after some lost goat or donkeys, not to go be prophesying God's holy word and interpreting it and things like that. But he's coming across these other prophets, and he begins to prophesy. It says here in verse 6, the Spirit of the Lord will come upon you in power, and you will prophesy with him, and you will be changed into a different person. So, it's kind of like this initiation. It's kind of like this preparation in his beginning. Samuel meets Saul. He instructs him about his future. He anoints him, which is a big thing you do back then and even now, really. He's anointed. He's giving this blessing over. And then he's sent, and he's like, here's this next preparation thing. You're going to come across these prophets, and you're going to start prophesying with them. Even though it's nowhere near the gifts that your talents that you have, you're going to do that. And then you're going to be changed into a different person. And it may not be necessarily this physical change, but it's going to be this spiritual change that is going to take place. It's what's going to really prepare Saul for what is coming. And that's what God is doing. God is getting Saul ready to be king by making this happen. And you look at this and it kind of makes you wonder, what in our life does God do, and where does he send us, and what situations does he have come into our life that is getting us ready for what's next, getting us ready for, what is to come. And I think that is something we need to kind of pay attention to, because I believe that God constantly is preparing us for the next thing. He's constantly getting us ready, and we need to always be ready. Not just wait to get trained to do something, or just wait for God to say, I'm getting you ready for something. We should always be ready and prepared. But when something big comes in our life, God will prepare us. And in a sense, we become changed into a new person. When we accept Christ into our life, we're reborn, right? We're born again. And so we are changed. We're still the same person physically, mentally, and all this other stuff, but there's so much down in the inner workings. It's the most crucial part of our being. That's what's changed. And then it begins to work from inward outward, and we become this changed person. So this part, I believe, is a step of God preparing and getting Saul ready to be king. And so then you kind of go later on, Saul is made king. Samuel, the people were wanting Samuel to go and find this king. So Samuel finds this king, and he's announcing him. You skip all the way to like 24. It says, Samuel said to all the people, "Do you see the man the Lord has chosen? There is no one like him among all the people." Because right before that, they see that he stood, and this is what I said earlier, he stood he stood among the people and was a head taller than any of the others. And so he stood out. And he's actually, when Samuel is calling all the people, all the tribes and all the people around to announce this, he's looking for the man, and someone says, "Oh, he's hiding. Where's Saul? He's hiding among the baggage." So he pulls him out and shows him, and says, "This is your king. This is who the Lord has anointed to be king." And the people shout, "Long live the king!" And so then Samuel goes in once again, kind of reiterating the warning he did earlier. He starts explaining to people the regulations of kingship. He writes them down. He says, "This is the regulations. These are things that a king is going to want. A king, like all the other nations around you, have that you said you wanted. Good or bad. Take it for what it's going to be. Take it for being good. Take it for being bad. You take it as it is. But these are the regulations kind of putting down as what the king is going to be like and demand and things like that." So, Saul goes out. Samuel dismissed the people, each to his own home. Saul went to his home in Gibeah, accompanied by valiant men whose hearts God had touched. And then it says, "But some troublemakers said, 'How can this fellow save us?' They despised him and brought him no gifts, but Saul kept silent." So there are still some people who are not accepting Saul being chosen for whatever reason. You get a lot of this. There's the 12 tribes of Israel. There's these 12, and they're all God's people. They're all Hebrews. They're all, Israelites. But there's different parts of that. So there's 12 tribes. And so you get a lot of that intertribal feuding kind of happening. And so maybe that could be part of it. Maybe they don't like that, Saul is a Benjamite. And that's the other thing too, is that when Samuel drops his bomb on Saul, Saul's like, but I'm the lowliest of the lowliest tribe here. I'm a Benjamite. We're the smallest tribe. We're the littlest, or whatever however you want to explain it. He's like, why me, type of thing. And so maybe that's what some of these troublemakers are like. They're like, how could this guy, I don't care if he's a foot taller than me, how could he save us? How can this Benjamite from this lowliest tribe, how could they save us? Whatever the reasoning. But see here, Saul kept silent. So he didn't say a word. He didn't yell at them. He didn't, get that kingly voice and say, "Oh, you're executed." He didn't do that. He kept silent. So once again, just kind of paraphrasing all this up, this is just laying the groundwork to Israel, God's people, beginning to have their first king. Like I said, I think that's important to kind of look at that and see where God is leading this and how God is preparing the way. And then, of course, we're going to get into here later what happened to Saul. What happened to him personally and how things started shifting and changing, and thus making the situation call for a new king to be found. Thus entering in our hero, our warrior king, to come in and change what it means to be a king. So that's it. That's all I kind of wanted to kind of touch base on, just kind of paraphrasing, just lightly going over some key points that are happening of Saul getting anointed to be the next king, him being announced to being the next king, and kind of even the mentality of some of the people going into this. And so, we'll touch a little bit on Saul some more, just about some of the some of the great things that he did, and then kind of going into maybe where he started falling. But we'll kind of get into that, and like I said, just build this story up, setting the platform up for when David comes in. So thank you so much for tuning in on this, and make sure you check out the first part of this series so you kind of know where we're coming from, so you can watch this in order. Find the link, whatever it may be. And if you haven't, if you're seeing this on Facebook or wherever you're seeing this, making sure you're subscribing to YouTube, signing up on all the texting services that we have. So you're staying in tune, you're staying in touch, and you know what's happening, and continue on with this video series so you can kind of see it from beginning to end. That is all I have. I'm going to stop rambling, and we'll catch you guys in the next video.